We are here to begin the discussion around the increased or improved services requirement, which is one of the key principles within the local control funding formula, or LCFF. As I've already mentioned, my name is Joshua Strong. I'm the administrator in the Local Agency System Support Office at the Department of Education, and I am joined by my team today to go over this first part of increased or improved services. This is another one in our webinar series. We have increased or improved services part 2, which is coming up on Thursday. Just to give you a little bit of excitement, my staff claims that it is probably one of the most boring webinars on the planet because we look at expenditure tables a lot. So that should get you excited for the upcoming webinar. Following that, in the new year, we have the Equity Multiplier Goal webinar that we'll be doing on January 7th, and then the Learning Recovery and Emergency Block Grant requirements, which we'll be doing on January 14th. The purpose of today's webinar is to really talk about the foundational principles of the LCFF and how that relates to the requirement to increase or improve services for our unduplicated student groups. For those of you that are new to LCFF, the unduplicated student groups are referred to as such because they are an unduplicated count of our students that are eligible for free and reduced price meals, that are English learners and or foster youth. We'll get into the overview of the requirements to increase or improve services for those students, and then we'll talk about the types of actions within the LCAP that are used to demonstrate how LEAs are meeting the requirements to increase or improve services, as well as some recommendations for developing those actions and how to write that up within the LCAP. The intended audience for this is anybody who's going to complete or review or interact with the LCAP, especially those that are going to be developing or working on the LCAP. This is a critical piece to know and understand. So as we've talked about in terms, as in our webinars over the past month or so, in terms of foundational principles of the LCFF, there's a threefold focus. There's LEA improvement based on multiple measures of success. So we're looking at not just one measure of success, but across multiple areas. We're looking at equity, where there's additional funding to address specific identified needs, and that really comes into play here with the increased or improved services requirement. And then there's the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is that idea where local decisions are best made at the local level, and that in order to do that, there has to be transparency, there has to be shared decision making and collaboration in order to make sure that those decisions that are being made at the local level are benefiting those that they're intended to benefit. In terms of the LCFF, LCFF provides funding flexibility. And this is certainly apparent with the increased or improved services requirement. For those of you that are familiar with Title I or Title III funding, you know that it's restricted to particular students in general. That it's supposed to be used on those that are most in danger of failing to meet the state's academic standards. And you can do LEA-wide and school-wide actions, but there's a particular intent there. It's somewhat similar in the LCFF with the increased or improved services requirement, except for the funding being unrestricted. And so there's in return for that, that unrestricted funding, there's more of a burden on the LEA for the LEA to develop appropriate and effective programs. As we've talked about in our intro to LCFF webinar, the LCFF funding formula is based. This is a really simple version of it. There's a per student base grant that's adjusted based on 4 grade spans. And then it's also adjusted based on the number and concentration of low-income English learner and foster youth students within the LEA. And that identifies the apportionment for LCFF for that LEA. All of the funding within LCFF, as I've mentioned before, is unrestricted. It doesn't matter if it's calculated using the base grant, the supplemental grant add-on formula, the concentration grant add-on formula. All of it is unrestricted funding and can be used on anything that's allowable under the education code. In return for that, LEAs are required to demonstrate in the LCAP how it is that they're increasing or improving services for students that are low-income English learner and foster youth in proportion to the increase in funding generated by those students. They have to, in doing that, to increase services means to grow services in quantity, and to improve services means to grow services in quality. So either the quantity or the quality of those services is increasing. When we're talking about in proportion to the increase in funding, it's important to understand that LEAs have to determine this proportional percentage and identify that within the LCAP. In order to determine that proportional percentage, there is, fortunately, at this point in time, a very easy mathematical equation that can be done, where you divide the LCFF funds attributed to the supplemental concentration grant by the remaining LCFF funding, excluding add-ons for targeted instructional improvement grant and the home to school transportation add-on grant. And that resulting percentage is what we refer to as the minimum proportionality percentage. That's the minimum percentage that the LEA has to demonstrate how it's increasing or improving services by. And sometimes oftentimes we abbreviate that as the MPP, the minimum proportionality percentage. Now, in order to meet this requirement to increase or improve services, that's done in a variety of ways throughout the LCAP template. In order for the LEA to demonstrate how it's meeting that, they're going to identify particular actions within the plan as contributing towards meeting the increased or improved services requirement. And so we've got some snippets here from both the expenditure, the action tables, as well as the action table within the Word document template. And we'll look at how these fit in a moment here. So when we're talking about the demonstration for how the LEA is increasing or improving services, we start with the goals and actions section, and particularly the contributing actions column, where we're identifying those particular actions that are contributing towards increasing or improving services for our low-income English learner and foster youth students. Then we have the measuring and reporting results section. Within the measuring and reporting results section, this goes to demonstrating how we're increasing or improving services because of the requirement. to ensure that these actions are having an impact on our low-income English learner and foster youth students. And so specifically for any LEA-wide or school-wide actions that are contributing, they have to have one or more metrics identified that are measuring the effectiveness of those actions. And so those are included within the measuring and reporting results section. At a minimum, there has to be, of the metrics that are called out within the increased or improved services section, there has to be, at least one of those that's showing up with per action, that's showing up within the measure and reporting results section, and making sure that is there, so that when we're doing the goal analysis piece, it can be used to demonstrate whether or not the actions are being effective. So that's a requirement for those LEA-wide or school-wide actions. That is not a requirement for limited actions, which we'll touch on here in a little bit. Then we get into the increased or improved services section. And of course, the increased or improved services section is where the majority of the information related to this requirement lives. We've got a number of portions of the increased or improved services section. The first piece that we have is the LEA-wide and school-wide actions. And within the LEA-wide and school-wide actions, the LEA is reflecting upon the identified need of those low-income English learner and foster youth students, then describing how the action addresses the need. And then, since it's being provided on an LEA-wide or school-wide basis, how is this principally directed towards the unduplicated student groups, and how is it being effective in? And the effective in piece is really captured in that third column, where there's the metrics to monitor effectiveness. And within that particular column, that's where LEAs are calling out the particular metrics that are being used, that are showing up within the measuring and reporting results section, and are making that tie between how these LEA-wide and school-wide actions are being effective in improving outcomes for the unduplicated students. Then continuing in the same section, we've got the limited actions. Now, limited actions are specific to one or more of the unduplicated student groups. So they're being provided specifically to low-income students, or specifically to English learners, or specifically to our foster youth. And it's also worth reminding ourselves that when we're talking about English learners and low-income students, that also includes subgroups of those students. So, for example, low-income students includes homeless students. Low-income students also includes foster youth students. Then with ELs, your English learners, that also includes those students that are classified as LTELs, the long-term English learners. And it's absolutely possible within this requirement and within the LCAP for there to be specific actions related to LTELs or related to homeless students that are also contributing actions, because they're addressing the needs of a subgroup of the English learners or a subgroup of the low-income students. And those could show up either as school-wide, as LEA-wide, or as limited actions. But with the limited actions, these are being provided specifically to those student groups. They're not being provided to all the students within a particular school or all of the students within the LEA. The significant difference between the LEA-wide and school-wide actions and the limited actions is in the second column. In both of the tables, you're identifying the need of those students and explaining what that need is, what the data is that has identified that need. Then in the second column, you're identifying how the actions are designed to address the need. But unlike the LEA-wide and school-wide actions, in the limited actions, you're not providing an explanation of why this is being done LEA-wide or school-wide, because obviously it's not being done LEA-wide or school-wide. Then there's also the requirement in both the LEA-wide and school-wide actions and the limited actions to identify the metrics that are being used to monitor effectiveness. At a minimum, that has to be one metric for each action or group of actions. It can be multiple measures of progress. And that can include additional pieces of information that are not necessarily included within the metrics. They're more qualitative actions, and so they're based on educational partner input, but they're not. They aren't like measures of progress. LEAs are not required to have either LEA-wide or school-wide actions or limited actions. You could choose and just have LEA-wide and school-wide actions, or you could just have limited actions and forego, the LEA-wide and school-wide. As long as you have actions within the plan that are demonstrating how it is that you're increasing or improving services. They can be LEA-wide, they can be school-wide, they can be limited. There's no requirement that you have to have a limited action in the plan. Then in addition, the limited actions also bring in this piece around the percentage of improvement, because it's possible for an LEA to actually not use funding in order to meet the increased or improved services requirement. As a general rule, in order to meet the increased or improved services requirement, there has to be LCFF funding attached to that. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But it is possible for the LEA to identify a planned percentage of improved services. And if the LEA does that, it's only for limited actions. You can't identify a planned percentage of improved service for an LEA-wide or school-wide action. It can only be done for limited actions. And if you do, then you have to fill out this particular prompt within the limited actions portion, where you're identifying the rationale for how that the methodology for how that planned percentage of improved service has been calculated, and we'll get more into that in a little bit here. This also, the increased or improved services section also includes this requirement related to the additional concentration grant funding that the school districts and charter schools receive. This is an additional 15% of the concentration grant that is specifically to be used to increase the number of staff providing direct services to students at schools that have a high concentration of unduplicated students. Within this particular prompt, in the first prompt above the table, LEAs are required to identify the specific actions that they're using to implement this. So they're going to call out, what actions within the LCAP are being used to implement this requirement. And then within the table, they're going to provide the staff to student ratios of both classified and certificated staff, and at schools for students with a concentration of 55% or less and greater than 55%. This is required to be completed by all LEAs that receive the additional 15% concentration grant. LEAs that do not receive the additional 15% concentration grant, this doesn't apply to them. But if an LEA is received, whether that's a charter school, whether that's a school district, if they're receiving that additional concentration grant add-on, then they have to complete this particular portion, both the prompt and the staff to student ratio table. Then the fourth section within within which we demonstrate the increased or improved services requirement is in the goal analysis section, specifically in prompt 3, where we're looking at the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the specific actions in making progress towards the goal. And if we go back to the things that we discussed in our goal analysis webinar, this is where we're calling out, based on data and the input from educational partners, how do we know whether or not our actions are being effective? Obviously, our metrics, our measures of progress are going to give us some sort of data that we can reflect back on in terms of how the implementation of these actions is contributing towards positive improvement for students. That's something that we want to call out. It's also possible to, look at ways that it's also possible to identify that an action is currently showing as ineffective. Remember, that's okay at this point in time. We don't determine that we have to change actions until the end of the 3-year cycle, once we've been implementing those actions for 3 years. So it's also possible to identify that a particular action has not been effective based on the data that we currently have. And we might make some small adjustments to implementation or things like that. We don't have to change the action at this point in time. And so, just realizing that this is something that's called out, and here we're thinking specifically about those actions that are part of the increased or improved services requirement. They're the ones that are contributing, and so we're looking at how those have been effective or have not been effective at this point in time. And then the last place that we see this demonstration of increased or improved services is within the action table, and specifically within the contributing actions table. It actually shows up both within the contributing actions table and within the contributing actions annual update table. One which is looking ahead to the coming year, one which is looking at the implementation within the current year. And so within this particular action table, LEAs are identifying the projected percentage to increase or improve services, the carryover percentage, if there is any, and then that brings about the total percentage to increase or improve services for the coming year, which is that box that's in red, that's outlined in red there. The LEA is then identifying the planned contributing expenditures using LCAP funds, as well as any planned percentage of improved service, which does not use funding that's being used for limited actions. And then that leads to the planned percentage to increase or improve services, which is that yellow outlined box. And the simple test to see whether or not an LEA is demonstrating that it is increasing or improving services in proportion to the increase in funding generated by those students is to look at whether the planned percentage to increase or improve services there outlined in yellow, is greater than or equal to the total percentage to increase or improve services, which is outlined in red. If the planned percentage is greater than or equal to the total percentage to increase or improve, then the LEA is sufficiently demonstrating how it plans to increase or improve services. Otherwise, the LEA is not, and the LCAP can't be approved. In order for the LCAP to be approvable, then the planned percentage has to be equal to or greater than the total percentage to increase or improve services. So, contributing actions. Let's see. What? Let's see. I'm doing this part. I'm not handing it over yet. So, what is a contributing action? A contributing action is an action that's being implemented in order to identify how the LEA is increasing or improving services for students that are low income, English learner, and foster youth. Each action that's increasing increasing or improving services is going towards the demonstration of how the LEA is meeting its MPP. And so for the action to contribute towards the demonstration that it's meeting the MPP, the LEA either has to use LCFF funds or it has to identify the planned percentage of improved service. Generally speaking, though, LEAs meet this requirement by identifying LCFF funds that are being used for particular actions. So a contributing action is an action that seeks to address one or more of the identified needs of low-income English learner and foster youth students. If the action is being provided on an LEA-wide or school-wide basis, it has to first and foremost be designed to benefit the low-income English learner and or foster youth students and address their particular needs. And that has to be the primary consideration over and above, what's best for all students in general. It's really focused on what's going to make the most impact for our low income or English learner and or foster youth students. An action that's provided on a limited basis is only provided to those students. And so obviously in a limited action, there's not any consideration about what's being done for students that are not low income English learner and or foster youth. It's just looking at what's specifically being done for those students. If there's funding that's associated with the action, like if the action does not have zero funds in it, in order for the action to be contributing, there have to be LCFF funds in there. If an LEA puts down that in their expenditure tables that an action is contributing and that it's serving low-income students and that it's funded out of Title I, if it's funded out of federal funds, that action is not increasing or improving. That action is not contributing, even though the action has been marked as contributing. It doesn't count at all. There's nothing that goes towards the MPP because that LEA is not using LCFF funds. Now, the LEA can choose to split fund the action. The LEA can identify an action as contributing and then have some of the funding from the action come from LCFF and some of it come from federal funds. And that would work, that would be contributing, but only the portion that's funded out of LCFF would be contributing towards meeting that MPP, which is kind of one of the things that throws some folks off because they identify an action as contributing, They put a bunch of money into it from other state funds or federal funds or local funds, and it doesn't contribute anything towards the minimum proportionality percentage because it's not utilizing LCFF funds. So that's an important factor to be aware of. If the action does not have any funding associated with it, it could still be contributing if it's identified as a limited action and the LEA identifies a planned percentage of improved service. Otherwise, if an LEA identifies an action as not having any funding, again, it's not going to contribute. If there's no planned percentage of improved service and there's no LCFF funds or no funds at all associated with the action, obviously it's not contributing anything towards the minimum proportionality percentage. So we've already touched on the three types of contributing actions. We have LEA-wide, school-wide, and limited to unduplicated students. It's possible to have a action that is limited to unduplicated students be provided at multiple school sites. It's also possible to have actions that are provided on an LEA-wide basis that are only going towards certain grade spans or certain grades of students. It's also possible to have LEA-wide or school-wide actions that are looking at a particular demographic of the low-income students. So, for example, you could have an LEA-wide action for homeless students, and that would be looking specifically at those homeless students throughout the entire LEA. You could also do that as a limited action. So there's different ways that you could do it. When we're talking about LEA-wide actions, these are actions that upgrade the educational program of all schools within the LEA. All students are going to receive these services. If we're talking about school-wide, then it's upgrading the educational program at particular schools within the LEA. What schools those are can be identified within the action tables, and the specific schools could be called out there within the action tables. All of the students at those specific schools would receive the services. There's a question as to whether or not an LEA can create a limited action for LTELs, long-term English learners. Absolutely, that could be done as well. And then we've got limited actions, the actions that are limited to the services only being provided to low-income or English learner or foster youth at specific schools within the LEA. And generally, these are going to be things that are more targeted. They're going to seek to address particular individual needs of the student groups themselves. So looking specifically at what are the needs, one of the most common forms of limited actions that we see are related to English learners or potentially LTELs that are receiving certain instruction or certain additional services based on being an English learner, and those are things that are only being received by those particular students. Obviously, you don't necessarily need to provide certain like supplemental curriculum or things like that to all students when we're talking about English learner programs. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Heather Bell, and she's going to walk you through how the practice of designing an increased or improved services section or action. So I'll turn it over to you, Heather.
Thank you, Josh. Hi, everyone. So the next couple slides will go into the, like Josh said, the practice of developing contributing actions, kind of the process and like the different steps that you would take to meet this requirement. So this slide breaks down all 6 steps and then, or lists all six steps, and the next slides will break them down. So step 1 is to gather and analyze data. Step 2 is to identify needs. Step 3 is to develop strategies to address those needs. Step 4 is to identify measures of effectiveness. Step 5 is to determine scope of actions. Scope is LEA-wide, school-wide, and limited. Those are the 3 scopes. And then step 6 is to evaluate effectiveness. So step 1, when you're gathering and analyzing data, you're basically going to compile data for the entire LEA, but also the LEA's low-income English learner and foster youth students from multiple sources, including but not limited to. These are just examples, right? State data, so your dashboard data, data quest, kind of anything that you compile that is given to the state, right? Or generated by the state. Local data, local indicator data, LEA level benchmark assessments, school level assessments, student demographic data, circumstantial data, what's happening in your community, that type of stuff that can help inform identifying needs. Educational partner input. This is something that a lot of people don't necessarily think of as data to gather and analyze, but it's almost more crucial than any other data piece that you will look at. Educational partner input, not just from parents in the community, but also from teachers and students and staff and administrators and all of them, really help add additional insight in developing and addressing root causes. So once you've gathered that data, you're going to analyze it, and you're going to compare the low income, the EL, and the foster youth student data to your other students' data. And you're going to see what discrepancies that you find. You're going to talk to your educational partners, and they're going to help you evaluate these data points and determine areas of need. Because again, everything may be written down on paper, but without discussion and without delving deep into what is actually there, you're not going to necessarily be able to identify the root causes of what you're seeing at face value. You want to make sure you get into the nitty-gritty. So you're going to ask things like, why are we seeing these results? What barriers are the low-income EL and or foster youth students facing that may be causing these results? And remember, not all barriers are academically related. On paper, you may see, oh, we have XYZ dashboard results, but that doesn't tell the full story. Your educational partners are crucial in being able to help you connect those dots. Like if you have a group of foster youth students and you're noticing within your district that those students are constantly being moved around, different schools, in and out of the district, that type of thing. That's a barrier to their education that can lead to struggles academically, right? But it almost comes before them getting to any kind of academic education struggles, anything that they're dealing with. So you want to look at those root causes, which go beyond just regular data points, quantitative data points. And so your data analysis, like I said, is not just done with one person at a district office, or if you're a large district, 20 people at a district office. The data analysis takes place in a variety of mediums, right? Through a variety of mediums. So you can do it at your parent advisory group or English learner parent advisory group meetings, student council meetings, staff meetings, PLCs, principal meetings, district level meetings. There's tons of different places that you can evaluate data, analyze it, discuss it, all of that. And so I don't want y'all to think of it in a limited space where it's like 2 or 3 people doing this. This is a collective effort. So step 2, again, identify the needs. So now that you've gathered all this data and you've analyzed it, now you need to look at the needs of the low-income English learner and foster youth students that have come to the surface. And they're going to be different for each LEA because everyone in California, each LEA in California is different. Everyone serves different students, they're different contexts, different circumstances. So to help identify needs, you might want to ask questions like, what did our low-income EL and foster youth students specific data demonstrate? Are there discrepancies between their data and other students' data? What feedback did we hear from these students' from these families? And what feedback did we hear from the students themselves? Those are the types of things that are going to help you dig deeper into the data that you see at face level, face value. And then again, the root cause piece, the root cause analysis is really the crux of being able to develop contributing actions. If you're not looking into the root cause, you will likely only address a need, and I put that in quotes, need, at the surface level without identifying the root cause of the need. So one of the questions you can ask are basic needs of these students being met? Are they in stable homes? Do they have food? Do they have transportation? That type of stuff. Is the discrepancy in the outcomes that you're seeing due to something outside of school? Is there something that requires systemic change within the LEA? These are tough questions that need to be asked before you can even attempt to address a lot of the academic discrepancies that you might see. And then you also want to look at common themes. Do you see common themes between those three student groups? And if you do, can you group their needs together and address them as like one action or through one strategy? Or are the needs different enough that you need to do multiple things to address them? All right, step 3 is to develop strategies to address the needs. Strategies are like actions. That's what it's another word for actions. So how will the LEA help develop strategies to address the identified needs? You'll use feedback, research-based practices, examples from other LEAs. I mean, there's a multitude of things that you can utilize to help yourself, the LEA develop ways to meet the unique needs. And it's okay to think outside the box, right? Like, again, every LEA in California is different. Students are different, circumstances are different. There isn't necessarily a right or a wrong way to do it. It's really locally determined, right? Based on your local context. So step 4 is to identify measures of effectiveness. So here's a hint. When you are doing your needs assessment and you are gathering data, you will likely gather data points and metrics, right? Or measures that you will use to find where your students are performing or where they are at that moment. And a way to determine if the actions that you are implementing are effective is to look at those same metrics, the same measures that you started with, and see, did they improve? Did our students show improvement? I don't want to say get better. That's not the way to say it. Show improvement. And if you look at where they started and where they ended up, that's a good indicator about whether or not you're seeing effectiveness with your actions. So the metrics that the metrics that are used to identify the needs are often, again, excellent metrics that are to be used to measure effectiveness. And also, metrics can include quantitative data, and that's usually the concrete, like your dashboard data or your benchmark assessments. They can include that, and that's kind of the thing that you can sink your teeth into. But they can also include qualitative data like educational partner feedback. And you'll see in the examples that we oftentimes combine both to help determine effectiveness. We don't rely on just one of the two. We'll usually see some quantitative data that is also supported by qualitative data to really give a rounded out picture of whether or not an action is working. Step 5 is determine scope. So y'all might be thinking, wait a second, wouldn't we want to know whether or not this action is going to be LEA-wide or school-wide or limited ahead of time? And truthfully, if you develop the action first, if you address them, you figure out the needs, you figure out how you're going to address the needs, then it makes the most sense to determine after that's all developed, whether or not you're going to provide it on an LEA-wide level, meaning it would benefit all of the students in the LEA, whether or not you're going to provide it on a school-wide level, meaning it will only benefit, maybe it only benefits certain grade spans or certain schools in the LEA. Or if you're like, you know what, this is really niche and really, really directed, this particular strategy is really directed towards the needs of this one unduplicated student group, we are going to only provide it to them. We see that a lot of times with like English learners because their needs are often very unique to like learning grasping the English language, right? And not all students would necessarily benefit from some of those strategies or would not necessarily need them. So we sometimes see limited actions, especially being focused directly on like the English learner unduplicated student group, something like that, right? So you would go through the process of developing the strategies and then determining how are we going to implement them. That's determining scope. And then step 6 happens throughout the school year. You've developed the LCAP, you're implementing it, you're cruising. Part of that mid-year update is to look at like where students are on your particular metrics that you've outlined or you've identified in your LCAP. You're kind of doing a check-in mid-year. So this is kind of a part that kind of is part of this whole evaluation of effectiveness. To be clear, you do not have to go through like these contributing actions are whatever for the mid-year update. It's just in general, you're looking at effectiveness. But for the evaluation of effectiveness, the formal evaluation, that comes at the end of the year during the annual update process prior to the development of the next year's LCAP. And like Josh said, it's documented in prompt 3 of the goal analysis section. So you're going to go through and ask yourself things like, have the yearly outcomes demonstrated that the identified needs of the unduplicated student groups are being met based on the progress shown in the identified metrics? Has input from educational partners identified that the actions are addressing the identified needs? This is the kind of information you're going to gather to determine whether or not the actions are in fact effective. And like Josh said, you're not going to necessarily see this like surge in effectiveness right away. We know that change is incremental, especially in education, but this is a way for you to check in throughout the 3-year cycle to determine if you're on the right path or if you need to make adjustments. Okay, so I'm going to put a quick disclaimer right now. It's 2:48. This webinar is being recorded. So if you have to leave, because I know it's supposed to end at 3, if you have to leave early, the recording will be available to you. But I don't want to rush through. There's 5 examples. So I'm not going to speed talk through them. So if you have to leave, I'm so sorry. FYI. And then also, if you're following along with the PowerPoint that's in the resources section, all the examples that I'm going to go over are on slides in that PowerPoint, but they are hidden for purposes of our presentation because we are going to go through the examples, or I'm going to go through the examples as they look in the LCAP template. Josh just pulled it up. So this is what I will be using. I will be speaking to on your screen. If you are following along in the PowerPoint, this information is on slides 40 through 89. But we're not going to click through those slides. So just FYI. This document is also in the resources section. If you'd like to have a copy of this, you can pull it up, all of that, but it's on your screen right now. Okay.
I will interject really quickly to say
Go
that
for
I
it.
wanted to make sure that you had those slides, both so that you could go back and review them, but also if you wanted to use these as trainings with educational partners or others, you had all of the information available to you to be able to walk them through these examples and have all of that information there. So again, like Heather said, we're not going over slides 40 through 89 in this presentation, but they're there for you to refer back.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Josh. That makes a lot of sense. So hopefully this helps you guys. So basically, this is what the increased improved services section looks like in the LCAP. The top boxes are where you fill in your financial information. So you're filling in your projected LCFF SNC funds. If you get the additional 15%, that goes there as well. And then the percentage to increase or improve services for the coming year. All of this is calculated in the action tables that Josh referred to before. We are going into a lot greater detail about this on Thursday in the really boring presentation that Josh mentioned. It's not that boring. But anyway, it's a lot of numbers. So you'll get more information about this, but this is what it looks like in the template. Okay, next. Now to the examples. So as you can see, this is the table that was implemented for the first time last year's LCAP. And you have 4 columns that Josh went over. The first column is where the goal and the action or actions related to that goal, the contributing actions, are located. You cite them there so that when someone is reading the increased improved services section of your LCAP, they know, okay, goal 1, actions 1 and 6 are contributing. And when they go back to the goals and actions section for goal 1, they will see action 1 has a Y for contributing and action 6 has a Y for contributing. Yay. So in this case, because goal 1, actions 1 and 6 are meeting the same needs, we've grouped them together in the explanation. You can do them separately. You can say goal 1, action 1 and goal 1, action 6 and do separate explanations, but you can also combine them like we did in our example. Okay, in the identified needs column, this is what is setting up your explanation for why this action or these actions are contributing. The identified needs column is essentially your intro paragraph, right? So you're citing the data that you've utilized, that you've analyzed, and if applicable, educational partner feedback. That's usually what lives here. So in this example, the attendance rate of our low-income students is 67%, which is 7% lower than for all students, 74%. This information will also live in your metrics section. So you're just kind of summarizing. It's just like, hey, this is what's happening. Educational partner feedback indicated we need to create a positive culture regarding attendance throughout the LEA and make transportation more accessible for low-income students. As you can see, there's in italics, see also engaging educational partners, reflections, annual performance, and the metrics section. That's for the reader of your increased improved services section to know, oh, if I want to know a little bit more information about these identified needs, I can look in those sections of the LCAP because there's probably more depth to what is captured succinctly in this column. So that's just kind of a strategy you can use so that you don't have to make the identified needs section 400 paragraphs. You can summarize quickly and reference the rest of the LCAP where the information also lives. Next column is the how the action or actions address the needs and why they are provided on an LEA-wide or school-wide basis. So the first little paragraph, we will provide additional transportation with a focus on areas low-income students live in and implement a new incentive-based program that emphasizes the importance of attendance. That's like a quick snippet summary of what actions 1 and 6 in goal 1 encompass. It's just a quick summary of this is basically what's being provided in 1 and 6. As you can see, these actions are directly tailored to the identified needs that are in column 1. So in column 1, we know that our low-income students' attendance rate, or I guess it's column 2, the identified needs column. We know our low-income students' attendance rate is lower than the attendance rate of all students. So that's already, boom, low-income students need help with attendance. Then we also know that educational partners are explaining to us that our culture at our LEA around attendance is not stellar. It needs some improving. And low-income students need additional transportation, right? These two actions, this summary right here, we're providing additional transportation, especially to low-income kids. And we're implementing a new incentive-based program to emphasize the importance of attendance. That's addressing the culture, right? So that right there ties directly to the identified need. Then the second paragraph in that column explains why the LEA is providing these services to all students and not just to low-income students. The actions are principally directed to the needs of low-income students. They are designed to address the needs of low-income students, but they are being provided to all students. So it says, these actions will create an opportunity to significantly increase attendance rates for low-income students. That's who it's principally directed to, because they are designed to address their identified needs. However, these actions are being provided on an LEA-wide basis to maximize their impact in increasing overall attendance rates for all students. As is seen in the identified needs column, low-income students' attendance is lower than all students. But 74% attendance for all students, there's a little bit of room for improvement there. So it makes sense to kind of bring everybody's attendance culture up and make this action or these actions apply across the LEA. Then you look at your last column, the metrics to monitor effectiveness. And if you've been around for a while, last year's presentation We modified very, very slightly to include the metric number in this column. Before we just had a description. We did this to demonstrate that there is no wrong way really to identify the metric in this column. You can identify it via the metric number, which is in the LCAP. You can identify it by describing it, or you can do both. So as you see, we will monitor progress in increasing the attendance rate of our low-income students as well as all students. That's metric 1.4. In this fictitious example, if I looked up at the LCAP, if this was a full LCAP and I went up to metric 1.4 in goal 1, I would see attendance rate, I would see LEA attendance rate, right? The percentage for attendance for the entire LEA. And I would see the attendance rate for low-income students. It would be disaggregated because we want to make sure the low-income students' attendance rate is improving, because this action is principally directed to the low-income students. Now, I'm not saying that disaggregation of data is an absolute must in every single instance. Some LEAs are really, 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 really tiny. And so it's hard to disaggregate data. I'm just saying that think critically about this whole process. If we are doing an LEA-wide action and it is principally directed to a particular unduplicated student group, and our goal is to improve outcomes for that unduplicated student group, we kind of need to be able to measure and to see, are those outcomes actually improving, right? So that's why I'm pointing this out. So that's where you'll see there's the metric 1.4 that's in the LCAP. That's the key. LEA-wide and school-wide actions are required to have metrics. This is a new legal requirement that went into effect last year. They all have to have at least one metric in the LCAP. The metric has to live in the LCAP. There can be additional metrics, additional measures that also help inform effectiveness, but there has to be at least one metric in the LCAP tied to each contributing action, okay? What I mean when I say that there can be metrics that don't necessarily live in the LCAP as metrics, I'm talking about things like feedback or even sometimes internal data that isn't always broken down as much in the actual LCAP because it can be so vast and large. But what we want to make sure is that you have at least one metric in the LCAP to demonstrate effectiveness, and you can also bring in things like feedback, as is pointed out here, from students, parents, and staff, right? Or any other educational partners or whatever. So that's a secondary metric that also helps monitor effectiveness. Okay, that was a long explanation for our first LEA-wide action. Next. Okay, so this one's a little nuanced. This is why I told you guys we're probably going to go over time. So this is also another LEA-wide action. This is an example of an LEA who has an LEA-wide action that is principally directed to an unduplicated student group, but also within that principal direction to that unduplicated student group also addresses the needs of a racial ethnic student group within that unduplicated student group. Here's what I mean. When disaggregating the CASP ELA performance of low-income students, so you start with your low-income students, that's the top of the pyramid, and you disaggregate it into ethnic subgroups, right? So this LEA disaggregated their low-income student data into the various ethnic subgroups in the LEA of low-income students. So it's low-income's the top, and then you look at low-income, in this case, low-income African-American, low-income white, low-income Latino. So when the LEA did that, they're looking at their low-income student group and they're looking at individual racial ethnic student groups within the low-income group. It says, when disaggregating this data, we found only 34.3% of our low-income African-American students are meeting or exceeding standard, compared to 55% of low-income white students and 71% of low-income Latino students. So this LEA, this example is an LEA that is taking an unduplicated student group and disaggregating the data even further within that student group. The reason for this is because not all low-income students are the same. They have different needs, and sometimes those needs are related to racial ethnic subgroups. Sometimes those needs are related to maybe like a homeless low-income student is different than a student that has housing security, who isn't living in the low-income bracket, right? There are differences. It's nuanced within each student group. Not all students are the same. And some LEAs will see that they have particular subgroups within a subgroup that need attention, right? And this is an example of that. So educational partners indicated the LEA's reading curriculum and classroom libraries do not include enough representation of African-American authors, subjects, and cultural practices. There is a need to add culturally relevant reading materials to the curriculum to keep African-American students connected during reading lessons. So this LEA said, we have discrepancies in our reading for our low-income students. Within our low-income students, we have even further discrepancies for our low-income African-American students. We are going to focus on bringing them up to help bring up the rest of the low-income students as well. But that student group needs some extra love, okay? So what is the district going to do? The district will purchase additional reading materials to include African-American authors, subjects, and culture. In addition, the district will convene a curriculum review committee to research an alternative reading curriculum that increases cultural representation of all ethnic subgroups with a specific emphasis on the African-American student group. That summary right there is reflective of Goal 2 Actions 1 and 2. Again, if I were to look at, if this was a full LCAP, if I was to go back up to Goal 2 and look at Actions 1 and 2, that's what they would be. The increase in, or the additional reading materials, and the district curriculum review committee. That's what they would be right there. Again, that next paragraph in this column has to explain why the district is providing these services on an LEA-wide basis and not just to low-income African-American students. So we're saying these actions are being provided on an LEA-wide basis because the purchase of additional reading materials and culturally diverse curriculum that feature African-American authors, subjects, and cultural practices will enhance the inclusivity of the educational experience for all students. Meaning, we bring up this subgroup, we're going to bring up everybody else as well. This is a wonderful benefit for all kids. Yes, it is intended to benefit the low-income African-American students' needs primarily. That's why it was designed, but all kids can benefit from a more culturally diverse curriculum. Every kid can, so we're going to give it to everybody. Then that last column, the metrics column, again, you can just list the metric number. It would be perfectly fine to say metrics 2.3 and 2.4. In this example, I broke down what those metrics are because we don't have a full LCAP. But if you have a full LCAP, you can just refer to the metric numbers. Totally fine. But in this case, I'm explaining, we will monitor progress on the CASP ELA assessment and the district reading assessment for our low-income African-American students, our low-income students overall, and for all students. And the reason that these particular metrics are broken down by all students, low-income students, and then low-income African-American students is because these actions are supposed to bring up the scores, the academic achievement, of low-income African-American students, low-income students, and all students. So you want to check, is this working? And you need to be able to see in your metrics, is it working? And then also that secondary effectiveness piece, we will also seek feedback from our African-American students and families and utilize the results from the district's curriculum review committee in further amending the district's reading curriculum and materials. So that's kind of the supplemental piece that will help really determine effectiveness, bringing a human aspect to it more than just what's on paper. All right, next example. 2 down, 3 to go. This example is a school-wide action. So according to our district reading assessment, only 36% of our low-income elementary school students are reading at grade level compared to 55% of all students, right? So we're looking at low-income, we're looking at elementary school. Pretend this is a TK 12 district. This district is looking just at elementary school students for this particular action. They're identifying in their elementary schools, this is an area of need, okay? Student feedback revealed many do not have a quiet place to read or access to books at home. Low-income parents also indicated they need training in how to help their child improve reading skills, right? Their reading skills. So this is showing that the district is focusing. This is a school-wide action because it is being provided to elementary school students only. High school students don't get this, elementary school, okay? The next column, what actions are going to address these needs? We will implement an after-school reading program for elementary students, reading two or more levels below grade level, prioritizing our low-income students for service. The programs will include quiet, designated reading spaces, access to books at the students' reading levels, and training for parents. As you can see, this summary is summarizing basically what is in actions 4 and 5 in goal 2. If this was a full LCAP, we could go up and look, and actions 4 and 5 would describe this, what I just read. And these actions directly relate to the needs identified in the identified needs column. Students are reading below grade level, they need quiet places and access to books, and parents need training, right there. And then that next paragraph is explaining why we're providing this on a school-wide basis. We expect these actions to significantly improve the reading assessment scores of low-income students who participate in the after-school program, as these actions are designed to address their identified needs. However, these actions will be provided on a school-wide basis because all students reading below grade level can benefit from opportunities to improve their reading skills, okay? And then we look at the metrics to monitor the effectiveness. As you can see, metric 2.1, again, if this was the full LCAP, we would go up to metric 2.1, and we would find that metric 2.1 is the district reading assessment. And the LEA is going to monitor progress on the district reading assessment for low-income students, as well as all elementary students at schools receiving services. This action will be provided school-wide to all elementary schools. Or actions, plural, okay? That's why it's a school-wide action. And then, of course, that secondary metric, the secondary measure of effectiveness, feedback. We always recommend that. That's crucial, okay? Yay, we're on to limited actions. 2 more! We can do this, guys. Okay, so limited actions. Remember, as Josh explained, a limited action is an action that is only being provided to one or more unduplicated student group. So if you have a limited action, it is either the services are either being provided to low-income students only, EL students only, which does include LTEL. LTELs are ELs, or foster youth students. You can provide limited actions to low-income English learner and foster youth students, right? But again, it means that the services are only being provided to students who fall into those 3 student groups, okay? So in this example, goal 4 actions 3, 4, and 5. The need is, it identifies the district writing benchmark and LPAC test scores indicate our EL students are struggling with writing and grammar skills. This action, this limited action, is for EL students, only ELs. Your low-income students and your foster youth and everybody else isn't going to receive these services. Only students who fall into the EL student group, which would also include LTELs because they are also ELs, okay? EL parents are also requested support in assisting their students at home. Boom. So how is the action designed to address the needs, right? Or how are the actions designed? We will implement supplemental ELD curriculum, provide professional development for ELD teachers in utilizing the curriculum, and provide training opportunities for parents of EL students to enable them to assist their students at home. So as you can see in the limited actions section, there isn't a second paragraph. There isn't a why are you providing this to EL students only, because there's no need for that. You will be able to tell why you are only providing this service to EL students based on what services are being provided. It's a limited action because only the EL students are going to receive and utilize the supplemental ELD curriculum. the teachers are going to teach the ELD curriculum. They're going to get training in it. And training opportunities will be read to EL parents, as you can see, right? You don't need to explain why only EL students are getting it. It's very linear. And then there is a metrics to monitor effectiveness column for limited actions. Josh did mention, technically in statute, it is explicitly written out that LEA-wide actions must have metrics in the LCAP. That is explicit in statute. However, part of the increased improved services requirement is determining effectiveness. If you are stating, you LEA, are stating that you are increasing or improving services for a student group, you have to be able to demonstrate that that's actually happening. You can't just say, we did this, it's great, without any evidence isn't really the right word, but without any way of demonstrating that the actions you're doing are actually benefiting the students that they're intended to benefit. Without having a metric to measure that, it's very difficult to demonstrate that you're affecting students positive, like you're increasing or improving services. So that being said, that's why there's a column here for metrics to monitor effectiveness for limited actions. So you do still need a way to monitor the effectiveness of your limited action. Okay? Even though it doesn't say it very explicitly in statute the way it does for LEA-wide. I'm letting you know there is a reason there's a column there. Okay? So in this example, we're going to monitor progress in increasing our EL students' district writing benchmark, LPAC test scores, and feedback provided by parents and families. And in this example, I cited metrics 4.2 and 4.5. In an actual LCAP, you'd be able to go up and see. You would want to see metrics that you're using to monitor the effectiveness of actions in the LCAP. And then, of course, also feedback, because that's always important to round out the effectiveness conversation. Okay, guys, last example. This is a limited action that would not have LCFF funding and therefore would instead have a planned percentage of improved services. This is the opportunity, the flexibility that LEAs have in meeting their minimum proportionality percentage without utilizing funding. So this is a way for LEAs to get creative. As Josh mentioned, it has to be a limited action. You cannot do this, you cannot have a planned percentage of improved services for an LEA-wide action. The only actions that can have a planned percentage of improved services, meaning they don't have any LCFF funding, they have no funding whatsoever. The only actions are limited actions. So here's an example of what that could look like. Okay? So foster youth students, that's the unduplicated student group the limited action is being targeted towards. Foster youth students, chronic absenteeism and suspension rates are disproportionately higher than those of their peers. Feedback from foster youth students and their families indicates they are feeling disconnected from school. That's the need, okay? They are disconnected from school. They have these higher chronic absenteeism and suspension rates. That's the need. What are we going to do? The LEA's Foster Youth Services Coordinator will implement a student engagement mentorship program utilizing volunteers. That's how the LEA is going to implement this action without utilizing funding. Wonderful people in the community have decided to volunteer for this program. Awesome. Identified mentors include teachers, staff, and community volunteers who will be trained by the Foster Youth Services Coordinator in developing nurturing relationships with foster youth and their families. Mentors will provide consistent contact, support, and resources to help them be more connected and engaged at school. Okay? So again, volunteers, that's why there's no funding associated, right? You still have to monitor progress. Obviously, this LEA has decided to monitor progress in decreasing foster youth students' chronic absenteeism and suspension rates. Those are metrics 5.1 and 5.4. They would be in the LCAP. They would be disaggregated by foster youth students' data as well to determine if this is effective for the foster youth students. And then also you'll get feedback from the foster youth and their families to help shape the program and continue it, right? So because this limited action, Goal 5, Action 5, does not have LCFF funding, but is still a contributing action, it will have what we call a planned percentage of improved services. So in order for an LEA, in order for a limited action to contribute that doesn't have LCAP funding, in order for it to contribute to your MPP, you have to calculate a planned percentage of improved services. And the way you do so is through a rationale, through an explanation. And that's what lives in this next prompt. And I'll demonstrate. So for goal 5, action 5 includes a mentorship program to help re-engage our foster youth students in school based on our current pay scale. So that's where the district is getting a dollar amount based on the current pay scale. The cost of hiring additional staff to provide these supports to foster youth students would be $450,000. So the district is estimating if they chose to implement this action with funding, they are estimating it would cost $450,000. Instead of hiring additional staff, we will be utilizing volunteer mentors, including teachers, staff, and other community members, who will be trained by the foster youth services coordinator in developing nurturing relationships with foster youth and their families. Okay, so we're going to use volunteers. The people would cost $450,000. So in the absence of spending $450,000 of LCFF funding, this action will account for 1.86 planned percentage of improved services. And the way that the LEA will calculate that planned percentage of improved services is to take $450,000, that number, and divide it by their base grant. And that will give them the percentage that that action represents of their minimum proportionality percentage, of their MPP. That's how the LEA determines how much credit, quote unquote, they get towards their MPP for this particular action. Normally, the credit that an LEA receives per action to meet the MPP is calculated based on the amount of LCFF funding that is used to implement the action. But in the case of this example, this action has no LCFF funding, no funding whatsoever, but it's still a contributing action. It is still increasing or improving services for an unduplicated student group. So the LEA still can get credit towards the MPP for this action, but they have to calculate it. And I will tell you, the instructions to the LCAP template break this down beautifully. Kudos to Josh. It is like very, very nice. And our LCAP development resources also break it down very beautifully. So you have multiple places that you can look to kind of get a refresher of what I literally just explained in terms of calculations. Okay, I think that's it. I think I'm done. Am I done, Mr. Strong? Am I finished? Do I turn it back over to you?
Yes, Heather. Thank
you.
you.
Is anyone out there still? I hope you all are there. Thank you.
No, you're getting thumbs up and applause and things like that. So good job, Heather. Thank you for all of that information and walking through those examples. Hopefully that's been valuable for you. One of the closing thoughts that we wanted to leave you with related to increased or improved services is to keep the focus on students, really making sure that you're focusing on those students when you're looking at the data, when you're engaging your educational partners, designing the plan, and describing how those actions are contributing towards increasing or improving services. Because after all, the focus of this is improving outcomes for students. So, keep the focus on the students. And then also, make sure that you use that full through line within the LCAP. The information, there's already great information that you've included within the plan summary, engaging educational partners. Make use of that, refer back to it. You don't have to continually redescribe everything within the plan. So take that opportunity to refer back to those pieces that are already there and tie that information together. As you're all aware, we've got increased or improved services part 2 coming up. You can show up and decide for yourself whether or not it's really as boring as I say it is. Then in the new year, we're looking at equity multiplier goals and LREBG requirements. If you do have a question for us, you can reach us at lcff@cde.ca.gov. And as always, thank you for attending. We appreciate all of you that have stuck around thus far for this webinar, but hopefully it's been valuable and you've been able to take some information back to your educational partners and LEAs. So thank you all very much, and we wish you a good afternoon.